Welcome to episode 6 of Founder Loveline, the event series modeled off of Dr. Drew's radio show Loveline. So this series is your founder hotline. So we'll be answering all of your burning questions featuring tech leaders who have been in your shoes and really get it. We started this series to make space for humanizing entrepreneurship and creating a community of founders that can build side by side with proactive tools, frameworks, and share tactical knowledge. This series has an incredible slate of speakers to come, so we're very excited to have you all join us. Today, we're super thrilled to have Sarah on. Sarah has started her career as an attorney at Google, but left to become an entrepreneur. She's founded and served as CEO for 3 companies, the last of which was sold to a private equity firm, Francisco Partners, for $400 million 5 years after it was founded. And today she's the general partner for an advisory firm called Enjoy the Work, where she works with CEOs of venture-backed startups from seed stage to pre-IPO. Sarah, thank you so much for being here today. And we're going to be talking about the art of the pivot.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
I love this topic, the art of the pivot. And Sarah, you have a lot of experience with this topic. So I'm really excited to get your thoughts on your personal experience and how you advise other founders to think about a pivot and how to execute it with success. So before we jump in, I'd love to get your thoughts on really what is a pivot? How do founders think about it? And how should you be kind of framing your thoughts about a pivot before you start?
Yes, thank you for that question, Allie. So I am a proud pivot master. I think that, we'll talk a little bit later about some of my personal experiences with pivots, but there's a time in my life where pivot equaled failure, or it meant that your previous assumption was wrong. And so it can be a really scary thing in a lot of ways. And now it's this badge of honor that I think when you do it successfully, you should be really proud of it, because it means that you're really listening to your data and really listening to your customers. So what is a pivot? A pivot, right? A lot of us think of a pivot as a U-turn or a 180. And in reality, a pivot can be a matter of a degree or two, a matter of inches, not miles. So when you think about a pivot, right, it doesn't have to have this super scary connotation of oh my gosh, we are going to have to change every single thing we're doing. It could be a matter of a small pivot in how do we think about a growth channel or some language that we're using. And so it doesn't always have to be something that's, a scary thing. Change can be good.
Yeah, totally. Change can be good. So when you think about a pivot being in inches or miles, the pivot pyramid comes to mind. Can you talk about how you apply that to thinking about a pivot and how you work with founders or think about it?
Yeah, definitely. So the pivot pyramid, right, is a concept that was initially created by 500 startups. And so, want to make sure to give, credit where credit is due, but it is this idea that there is a pyramid, if you can visually think about it, of different stages of a pivot. And this is something that at Enjoy the Work, we go over with our founders and our CEOs when they are considering a pivot, or when something's not working, customers aren't buying the way that we want, or, our unit economics aren't working, or whatever it is, where we have to start thinking do we actually have the right ICP, the right ideal customer profile? Are we going after the right customer in the right way with the right tactics? We use the pivot pyramid. So the idea is that their tip of the pyramid is the easiest, going to be the lowest lift from a pivot perspective, right? It's going to be the least amount of work to accomplish this kind of a pivot. And as you go down the pyramid and get to the base of the pyramid, that's going to be the most work for you and the team, the heaviest lift, probably the heaviest investment. So not all pivots are created equal. So the very top of the pivot, and again, for people listening, you can try to visualize this in your head. There's altogether 5 different layers to the pivot pyramid. So the very top of the pyramid is growth, right? That's going to be the easiest thing to pivot as far as what you're doing when you're building a company or a product. You've got growth channels, growth tactics. Are we going to do SEO versus SEM? Are we going to start going to conferences or do podcast sponsorships? Like if you've read the book Traction, in that book, they lay out 19 different growth channels. That book is now, over a decade old. So there's more growth channels that exist today than, existed at the time of the authoring of that book. But like the general framework is there is a finite number of growth channels. And so if you need to pivot a growth channel, you probably don't have to do a ton of work outside of some tactics and where you're going to put your budget and creating new assets for that growth channel. Then the second layer on the pivot pyramid is tech, right? Like, do we actually need to change our tech? Is there something that we need to do in how we're presenting our product within like the UX? Do we actually have to do something like add some additional features or remove some features or make the product somehow fit what the user wants more? Obviously, that's going to be more investment than, just changing your growth channels. And it could be a big investment depending on the amount of tech you need to change.
Yeah.
The next down on the pivot pyramid, the third kind of layer is solution. So is the solution that you're offering the right one? Are we going to start changing the solution to the problem we're solving, right? For every startup founder and every company, we start a lot of the time with a problem that we're trying to solve, and we figure out if we have a solution, are we presenting it the right way? Does it solve problems in the right way? Do we need to make some changes there? So that would be a pivot to your solution. The one below that, so now we're getting closer to the bottom, is problem. Like, are we actually pivoting and changing the problem we're solving? That's a pretty big one. I'm going to bet that problem initially was underlying a lot of why you started the company in the first place, why you made the product the way you did and presented the solution the way you did, why you made your team, in a certain way and built the team in a certain way. And then the very bottom of the pyramid, the most, challenging of the pivot pyramid is customers. Like, are we actually deciding that we're going to go after a completely different customer? Because that might mean that we're going to have to solve every single thing on top of it on the pivot pyramid as well, right? If we have a new customer, we potentially are going to have to make sure that we understand their problem. It might be different from what we're solving. Our solution might be different in how we present it. The tech that we need and the UX and the way we present the product is likely different. And that's going to probably affect our growth channels. So as you start at the bottom and go up, you have to realize you're probably going to have to make pivots and changes to the various layers to get to the top. Whereas if you start at the top, you're going to only have to make the changes, at the top of the pyramid.
Yeah, this is super helpful. I think a lot of our subscribers are pre-seed founders. So I think when you think about a pivot, like you were saying, think about it as a 180 or completely changing, and a lot of layers to it. So
the big thing, like Allie, that's so interesting. The pre-seed part is like when you're a pre-seed founder and you're really in ideation phase and you're like have an idea or you've seen a problem and experienced it, you might be pivoting like every day. And the reason why is that at this point, you should be thinking about every one of your ideas or your assumptions as hypotheses, right? Like we want to avoid at all costs assumptions, definitely want to avoid at all costs, like a total, being absolutely fervent in a belief. What we want to do with all of these early stage questions, and even as you're going into later stage, is like, curiosity. Like, yeah. I wonder if that is true. Like, what can we do to go and test it? And whatever we find out for the answer to that test or experiment is going to influence what's the next thing we do. So instead of being totally connected to like, this must be the answer, it must be right. Having this mindset around like curiosity and hypothesis and testing, and then, following the data to iterate, to get to another information event, to do another experiment, to find out more, is essentially just a series of like minor pivots in how you're thinking until you get to enough data and that inflection point to know that you've, have something that you should put more investment behind.
Yeah. And I think, like you've been saying, the data is the most, like data is king. Like you may be really tied to this idea and you think you have this mission, but when you're at the early stage, like you have to be relying on the data, and that's going to drive you forward rather than we think that this is what we think customers want, or we think this is what the problem is. Like, it might not be, and you have to be adaptable to that.
Or just because you experienced it as the founder of the problem doesn't mean that that experience is like necessarily universal to everyone else, right? Like the first, and I think a lot of us have done this. I've done it. I've started companies based on problems that I experienced with like a very hardcore belief that everyone had that same problem, experienced it the same way, they needed the same solution. And at the end of the day, like those are the assumptions that are like company killers and time wasters.
Mhm.
Because, instead of that, right, the belief that even I've done in the past and wasted time and money building something and going, a year down a path in the wrong direction before I realized it, what would have been better to take my belief and my experience as a hypothesis, go and ask 20, 50 other people like me, gather the data, make sure it's a big enough sample size that like it actually is good data, and then use that to decide what I was going to do next. And if my initial experience or assumption or hypothesis was wrong, like whatever, it doesn't matter. I'm not in this to prove that I'm right. I'm in this to build a product or a service that will solve a problem for people and bring value. And I'm in it to make like something that will help people and bring them that value that they need.
Yeah. So let's dive in a little bit on your own experience with a pivot. Um, you've probably had quite a few. So give us some under the hood examples of kind of where you started, why you thought about the pivot, why you thought you needed it, and what happened.
Yeah, I think there's this, when as a founder, right, you hear these stories of like, oh, we saw a problem and we made a thing and it like worked really well, like a rocket ship, and the growth was like up and to the right, and like now we're, Airbnb or whatever. And like then you dig in on these stories, or as has become more public, like actually it was really hard. Like we went through years of like being in what Airbnb called the trough of sadness. Like we don't know what isn't working about this. Like, we can't figure it out. And then we figure something out and we get this inflection point and like, oh my gosh, the thing takes off. Like there's usually this version of like what we present, to the public sanitized, what I call glossy version. And then there's like the real version. And for a long time, I like to present the glossy version of my story, because it made me be less embarrassed, I guess, about some of the mistakes that I had made along the way. And so I'll tell that glossy version. That's like, I think very helpful, right? I was an attorney at Google. I saw a big problem in how attorneys and law firms got paid. Attorneys and law firms are getting paid by check. Not only was I an attorney, I grew up working at my family's. My parents were both attorneys at their law firms. Everybody had a problem with getting paid. So I left Google to start a payments company for the legal industry that fit the regulatory and compliance needs of the industry, but was as easy to use as a consumer payment platform like Venmo. And that company raised VC funding and the customers loved it. And it was acquired 5 years after it was founded for like a big sum of money. That sounds like such a great version of that story.
Up and to the right.
It's so clean, right? Painless, like wrong. That is like super sanitized. Okay. The real version is that I left Google and actually wanted to found a consumer company. Like that was my obsession at the time. And I ultimately did found 2 consumer companies. Both were venture backed. Both I look back and I'm like embarrassed at those meetings because I did not know at all what I was doing or talking about. I didn't go to business school, went to law school, and neither of them worked. They were both like really good ideas that had, issues. The first one was before Stitch Fix did maternity, for people familiar with that company, it was like Stitch Fix for maternity, an algorithmically based matching product that would send clothes to pregnant women, and was at the time when like the box companies were like super popular. Well, like what I learned from that is that the LTV to CAC, right, the lifetime value to customer acquisition cost ratio wasn't good. Like they say, you need at least a 3-to-1 LTV to CAC for your business to make sense. Meaning whatever you spend on a customer to acquire them, you make at least 3 times that in the lifetime of the customer, and hopefully much more than that, frankly. Well, you only have a pregnant person for a certain number of months, and then they're not pregnant anymore. And so like you lose the customer. So the LTV to CAC didn't work. Okay, so I learned from that. And so again, probably could have like listened to the data more closely and pivoted sooner and saved myself time and money. But I didn't. I didn't know some of the things that I know now. And so then expectantly, and then the first company pivoted into the second one called Expectantly. And Expectantly was like rent the runway for like high-end expensive things for your family. Strollers and, you know, bouncy seats and all of these things. We went and got the first rental agreements with Baby Bjorn and Up a Baby and Stokey and all of these really well-known fancy baby companies. We had Warehouse in the Dog Patch in San Francisco. We had Method as our like green cleaning partner. And like that was a really logistically heavy business. Like their last mile delivery is really difficult. That was a term we didn't even use back then. But what I learned from that is like, I don't have the founder market fit for that. Like I didn't grow up working in a family business of like a warehouse. Like I don't intimately know about that business. And the gap that I had in my experience, especially as the CEO of the company, was something that I didn't think I wanted to spend a lot of time trying to overcome. Like I learned from that business that it wasn't the right business for me. And I, you know, again, just things that if I would have really followed the data in that earlier, I would have figured that out. And it was that company, right? We had raised venture, we had customers, like all of these businesses were like seemingly working on paper. But I knew that they weren't deep inside. I knew it wasn't right. But the Expectantly was doing well enough and interesting enough that we got into NFX, had an accelerator program at the time. This was in 2016. And NFX is a venture fund located in San Francisco and in Silicon Valley, early stage. And I remember that one of the founding partners at that firm, James Courier, you know, I was interviewing with him to, you know, try to get accepted into the accelerator. And he said, "Oh, you're such an interesting founder to me. You're such an interesting CEO." And I remember feeling like so complimented, like, "Oh, thank you. Why?" And he said, "Because you're a really smart, great founder working on the wrong business." And I was really taken aback. And he said, the next question was, "How long are you going to work on this business, the Expectantly business?" And I said, "As long as it takes. Like, I'll never give up. I'll keep going, no matter what." And I remember him kind of being like, "Okay." And that somehow we still got into the accelerator, but like that was the exact wrong answer. The answer is, as I've learned, until I see the data doesn't support that this is actually a product or service that the customer wants, or that I am the right founder, or I actually want to continue to work on. And so for a long time on my LinkedIn, I only had like right from Google to Headnote, right? So Headnote was the payments company for the law firm. Expectantly, as crazy as it sounds, now that's a 180 pivoted into a payments company, a B2B payments company for the legal industry. And which made total sense for me as my background is founder market fit, big market size, right? Like a problem we knew how to solve. The margins on software were much more attractive for me. Like there was just a lot of things that business just made sense for us and our team and the need in the market. But for years, I like kept my LinkedIn super sanitized. It was like right from Google to Headnote to Exit. And it like, again, looked like, wow, what a great, like easy experience that must have been. And finally, this was only like a year, maybe a year ago, 2 years ago, I like updated my LinkedIn to include Foxy Mama, the maternity company, Expectantly, the second company, and like listed in there, like these were the reasons here's what I learned from this business didn't work, and here's what I learned from it. And I do feel like it's like a badge of honor rather than something to be embarrassed about now.
I think that's so interesting and also so fascinating that he saw that so immediately. Like, you're so smart. I love that you asked why, because like that's just like the founder curiosity of like not just taking the compliment, being like, "Oh, I'm so curious why you think so," and then you're like, "Oh, never
Not a compliment.
got that immediately." I think that's also why feedback is so important. And especially, you know, when we talk about founders who like ride and die for their mission and don't want to pivot, don't want to give up. It's not always a good thing because the feedback's important and being able to be adaptable is important. And like you may not have seen that if you didn't have that conversation at that time.
Oh, trajectory changing. And like, yeah, it's like you want, right, to be totally committed. You want to have a founder, like if you're looking at it as an investor, or like, you know, if it's a team you're considering joining or whatever it is, like you obviously want a founder who's like super committed to the company and like figuring it out. But like that's the key part is like I'm committed to figuring it out, not like I am so committed to it necessarily needing to be this thing that I think it's going to be. And it's actually the founders who are able to say like and show a natural curiosity. Because listen, for early stage especially, like you're betting on the person, right? Like when you're thinking about investing or even joining a team or whatever it is, like if it's a super early company and we haven't figured stuff out, what we're really betting on is like this founder is going to be smart and scrappy enough, curious enough, data driven enough to figure it out so that when we hit that speed bump or roadblock of like, oh shit, like this thing isn't working the way that I thought it was, they're going to have the, you know, like moxie to figure it out. And they're not going to just give up. They're not going to be so attached to their idea that they like die trying, right? Or run out of money before you know, do enough experiments to figure it out. And so I think there is a difference between being committed, right, to like the company and the curiosity and, you know, being committed to being right and what your like assumption was.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was actually going to kind of go into like how do you communicate this to a team? Because when you talk about like talent acquisition, a lot of time you talk about in the beginning, you're kind of selling a mission and you're selling this set of values. That's how you get a lot of your talent because you can't pay like a big tech salary.
Right.
So you're kind of like, all right, this is going to be a big thing. And I think there's kind of this question of how do you pivot and still sell that mission? But I think, you know, you're kind of also selling yourself as we're going to be adaptable and you have to have that storytelling ability to keep people on board. And I think that's super important.
I think you're right, completely. And I think it's like when you're right building a really early stage startup, and this is something we also talk about a lot at NFX. And like Ali, you've heard this because we've known each other for like years and years. But another thing that the NFX team has talked about is like you really are optimizing early stage for this like thing we call commando mentality, right? Like there's kind of three different ways we think about it. There's early stage, you need commandos who are like they get dropped onto the, you know, into the field and it's like build a latrine, build a road, we got to get a school up and running. Like there's all these things and it's like we're all just like, you know, we can do it and we're excited to do it and like that turns us on. Like we like that. It's like being uncomfortable is part of the thrill of it a little bit, right? And then you get to a point where like things are kind of working, right? And then you need soldiers. Like you guys just go over there and build this latrine. You guys are on latrine duty. You guys are building roads. You guys are doing this. And people kind of get segmented and it's like, okay, like got it. And there are people who are more comfortable in that space. Like going into a world of chaos of commando land is not where they want to be. Like they want to know that like they've got an expertise or specialty, like stay in my lane. I'm really good at this thing. And then you get to a point where like everything is working and humming along. And then it's really like, don't fuck it up. And that's like late stage companies, right? Or like public companies, large companies, and that's police officers, right? Like now we just need people to patrol and make sure that like all the work the commandos and then the soldiers did, that's working so well and that we've now optimized. We don't want to mess anything up. And then you get into like highly specialized people. And this is like, again, I see startups do this all the time. They're like, we've got budget. This is the budget we have. And we can like hire this like amazing person who's been at like Amazon for 15 years, super senior VP level, whatever. And we're going to put all of our budget into it. And maybe that person was a commando at another time in their life and wants to be a commando again. But like, have we actually interviewed them and talked to them and like optimize the conversation around like, is this person a commando? Because what happens a lot is you get that like awesome super senior hire and they come in and then they're like, okay, I'm going to need like my budget for my team. And like, and you're like, no, you're the team. Like I need like a lever puller at this point. And it's possible that super senior police officer from Amazon hasn't actually built a road in
So
20 years.
yeah.
So I think when you're looking for that early team, this idea of like, and again, making sure you filter in the interview process for like, have they actually had startup experience? Thinking you want to be at a startup is really different from being at one. Everyone thinks it's like sexy and fun and exciting, but like it also is really uncomfortable not knowing exactly what the company is doing. Like there might be changes to your product roadmap that
Mhm.
occur at a higher frequency than like a later stage company. And so you need to make sure you have people that are a right fit for the stage of your company, as skill is important, but also like the stage of your company. And for a lot of those people, if we make sure that we've got the right folks with the right mindset and we set the culture of the company, right? And especially around like our mission, vision, values in a way that's like, we, be curious and, promote experimentation and like follow the data. And these are things we know that we like live by. Then when we need to make those changes, hopefully that actually excites people because we're like fulfilling what we said we would do as a company in our culture. And they kind of like being in the shit, like, and they signed up for it. If you have the wrong team or you have police or soldiers, again, Danielle, I know you know all this terminology too. It's like when that stuff starts going sideways, like they get really uncomfortable really fast.
Yeah.
The other thing on the pivot for teams, right, is a lot of this is like, how do we frame this to them? Like, and what I've found is that there isn't a way to get people really excited about this if you do it in the right way, because at the end of the day, what we're doing is like, we just found that we have this new opportunity. Like, it's not that the things that we've been working on were wrong. It's not that we wasted any time. It's like, we actually just figured this thing out, and like, congratulations and bravo to everyone for all this work that helped us figure this out. And now we have this opportunity to take this new learning and apply it to our product or our customers or whatever it is, in a way that's going to bring them more value. So like, it should actually make us like, this is going to help us fulfill our mission even faster. And if we can get everybody really galvanized and excited and be honest, right? Like, we are making this change. Everything that we've done to date has fed into this and has been super valuable. And now we're at a place where we actually have more confidence in what we're pursuing and we get to all be part of this together. If you do it the right way and you've got the right people who are excited by that around you, it will go well. And if it makes people that uncomfortable and they can't deal with it, then it maybe wasn't the right place for them in the first place.
Yeah, I'd imagine the cultural aspect of that plays so well into like who's leaning into the pivot, who's resisting, right?
Right.
And I think that the delivery is so important. And I love the way that you presented it. And to have that experience from a leadership standpoint, I think is very valuable to take those learnings. And but being on the receiving end of just like, oh, here's another change, right? It could be that, or it could be like, oh dang, like my CEO is freaking brilliant. Like they are really using data to drive decisions. This is the place that I want to be. Yes, I'm adaptable. Yes, right? It's like we all have a choice. We have a choice into how we receive that information. And I would imagine that becomes part of the culture and how you're, building your team and hiring people is like, this is how we run our company. It's a series of 1,000 pivots, and buckle up because like, we're going to figure this shit out.
100%. And like, I think there's something there too, which is like, I don't think any of us are saying, for people listening, like every day you should be looking at data and like changing what you're doing. Like there's this other side of it where if you are looking at every single data point that comes into your life, right? Like some of which might be shiny objects, and you're following all of those and it's making your team feel super uncomfortable because we're swinging on any day left and right. Like that actually is not a good pivot. Like that is not like the following of the data does need to be done within a framework that fits your company, but like at what, what's the cadence we're measuring data? What are the like KPIs that really matter to us? Do we have a North Star metric? Do we even know exactly what that is yet? And a North Star metric is one that like all companies, if they do that thing, all these other things happen, right? And it's not usually revenue. Like, again, to go back to Airbnb, theirs is nights booked, right? It could be like number of hosts, it could be number of people booking places, it could be revenue, it could be whatever. But like for them, they know that like nights booked, if they optimize around nights booked, all these other metrics for the company work. So it's like, we want to make sure that we're being really intentional with how we're making these decisions and how we're going to change course and like divert resources. And you want to make sure to do it in a way that's not going to make even the most brave startup veteran like annoyed or scared. But you want to make sure that you're open-minded to the fact that, things might change and we are adaptable.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to a pivot on it was a pricing model pivot, which could feel a little janky at first. It's like we went from transaction fee, like a per transaction fee to a percentage of GOV. And I think it mostly came from the board challenging us on how we can get, a larger revenue share there. But yeah, it's finding that balance, right? It's like, keep circling back to, is this going back to the long-term goals of our company? Is this aligned with our core values? Things like that. So good call out.
Yeah, definitely. And like, yeah, I think that for every, I don't know any founder or CEO that's been really successful that hasn't gotten comfortable with pivots and like taken it out of like it's not a bad word kind of, right? Out of change the mindset around it. And you're right. And sometimes it comes from like the board or, pressure from investors who are maybe seeing pattern that you haven't seen. Like they've seen a lot more companies. They have access to more data than you do when it comes to companies like your own a lot of the times. Or it's coming directly from customers saying like, we want this other thing, right? I mean, it's something that you don't know exactly where it's going to come from, but going back to this idea for companies that, for really early stage companies, I don't recommend getting like so obsessed with process because it can actually be like debilitating when, if you're just a couple people, like we don't want to like death by process is like a real thing. But I do think having, right, some form of like goal setting, right? A bottoms up financial model that's working backwards from some milestone, right? It's usually one of three milestones for startups. It's an acquisition, it's a fundraise, or it's getting to cash flow positivity, getting to profitability. One of those three things we're kind of always working backwards from, and having a financial model built out that actually, shows where we want to get to at what timeline, what are the gaps between where we are now and where we need to be. How are we looking at our data, right, on a month over month basis or whatever the right cadence is for you? And like those directly inform what are our goals for the year. And like, how do we look at those quarterly or annually? And a lot of times we call those OKRs, right? Objectives and key results, which was a concept originally made at Intuit and then got famous at Google. But like, I don't actually care what your goal setting vocabulary or methodology is, as long as like we have a way that our goals are obvious to the whole team. We have a way to measure them and we touch base on them on a regular cadence, whether it's weekly, because the point of those is to like make sure that we're staying really close to our data to get to the things that really matter and that we avoid shiny objects. Like if some other super awesome opportunity pops up, but we're going to have to like take all of this and like move it over into this, the resource diversion into this, like, do we do that? It's really easy for CEOs to be like, oh my God, I'm going to go hang my hat on that. Or like, team, we're going to do all these things. And you can't do everything. You can't do all those things really well, right? You can do all those things poorly or like average, but like really it's for a young startup, it's easier to do one or two things, like smaller number of things, and you can do those great. These, objectives and key results or these goals are made to help you avoid those shiny object moments, which also is another word for pivot. Like now we're going to like go and follow, this thing that seems interesting. You build those guardrails in, and then you actually have an ability to make a thoughtful pivot that is not emotional, right? Or not just based on like excitement or assumption. So it kind of comes back to how are we actually building goals and being really mindful about our operating model and projections and like making that part of our culture too.
Yeah. It's like the art and the science of a pivot. Just
Yeah.
both sides.
Good point. I always have said the art of the pivot, but you're right. There's some methodology there too.
I think that's super. Well, I could talk to you about this all day, and one of these days we'll get you back on to dive into how you got from expectantly to head no. And there's a
Yes.
lot of things that came into play in between those, but
Yeah.
this was awesome. This was so fun. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you both. I love chatting with you and getting to be with you. And I really appreciate you having me on today.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for being here. This was awesome. We'll
Yes.
see you next time.
Much.
Bye.
All right. Bye.